Hello and welcome to my September reading wrap-up. I read 12 books in September, most of them from the library, but I read a couple of books off my own shelf too, and I had a pretty good reading month overall, so let's get into everything that I read in September. The first book that I read in September was The Survivors by Jane Harper, which I read via ebook. This is an adult mystery novel set on an island off the coast of Australia. A young man comes back to town and essentially it kind of brings up some mystery from the past as well as things that are happening in the present day. 10 years ago, there was a really bad storm in this small town and a teenage girl went missing and two older men were on a ship that wrecked and they both drowned. And now in the present day, a woman has been found drowned and they're kind of potentially connected, but even if not connected, it's bringing up a lot of like memories of what happened then. And the young man who comes back blames himself for his older brother's death because his older brother was one of the men who drowned. And essentially there's just a lot going on and it's kind of difficult to explain because this book is one of those books that's just so character driven. Like, I gave this 4 stars. I love this book and this book has just made me absolutely obsessed with Jane Harper. This wasn't the only Jane Harper book that I read this month. It was so wonderful. I will say right off the bat, this is a very slow book. Like, it's definitely not like a very fast-paced, thrilling, like lots of high drama, lots of stakes, lots of like fast-paced whatever. Like, this is not that. This is slow. This is about the characters and the overall story, and like, yes, there is a mystery that is like the main plot, but the mystery kind of takes a backseat to the characters and their relationships, and it's just so beautifully done. Like, this whole book just fascinated me start to finish. Like, it was absolutely gorgeous. Like, oh, this made me adore Jane Harper. Like, if you haven't picked up her books and you're down for like a much more slow-paced mystery story, like, I cannot recommend this enough. This was just like absolutely stunning. I didn't super love the ending though, if I'm being honest. It was like, it ended a little abruptly. Like, as soon as all the information was revealed, it just kind of like stopped where it could have used an extra chapter maybe to wrap things up. And it was one of those things where there were a lot of like logical leaps that didn't necessarily make sense within the context. Like, this woman was found drowned, like on the beach, there's an ocean right there, and everyone immediately assumed she was murdered with like no evidence, no information. She's not a local, no one really expected her to be able to swim, the water's freezing cold, and everyone's like, yeah, she was murdered. Like, that's just like the general assumption that didn't really make sense to me. But it was like little things, like those were all little things, and the ending was kind of whatever. But this book was just about the characters, their relationships, like their growth throughout the book. Like, it was so wonderful. Everything felt like so real and authentic, and the setting was absolutely gorgeous, like so detailed, so really important to the story itself. And the story was beautiful. Like, the whole narrative of like everything that was happening and everything that went on in this book, it was just like, so often I feel like thrillers gain a lot of their interest, like the reader's interest, with cheap ploys of like, oh, like this is a secret that's being held back, or like this is a whodunit and you're just wondering like who did it, and that's what gets your attention for the book. Whereas this went a lot deeper. Like, it was so well crafted, it was so gorgeous. Like, I know this book isn't for everyone. Like, it was really slow, but it was so beautiful, and I genuinely cannot recommend it enough. Like, it was one of those books that just made me so happy, and I went and put every Jane Harper book at my library on hold because I was just really excited to continue on. Then I read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. This just came out in August, and I was so down to get on the hype train. Like, I don't do that much, but this book, like, I knew I wanted to read. I put it on hold at the library and I listened to the audiobook, and then I got this for my birthday, which was a little unfortunate because then I would have just waited. But this was really good. This is Jennette McCurdy's memoir. She was a child actor known most for her role on iCarly, which was very big in like 2010, maybe? I don't remember. Somewhere around then. But it was a big kids show at the time. And this book is essentially about the abuse she experienced from her mother, the eating disorder that her mother basically gave her, and the trauma she faced in the acting industry. It's very negative, so like that's a warning going in, very graphic, just like be prepared going into this book that it is a lot. I gave this 4 stars as well. I really enjoyed this. Like, she's just a really good writer. She's good at telling her story. She's good at like keeping your attention and making jokes and knowing how to share information and how to best like craft narratives. Like she's a really good storyteller, and honestly it made me kind of disappointed because reading, she talked about how like she enjoyed writing from a young age, like a lot more than acting, and her mother very much discouraged that and stopped her from writing. And it's just like, she's such a good writer. Like I really hope she writes more because I'm down to read more of her books. But this was just overall a really powerful story. Like, it's really hard to read, but it's also really touching, and I think she did a fantastic job with the emotion, with like connecting with the reader. Like, there's a reason this book has a lot of hype, and it's like, first of all, really interesting just to hear about like the behind the scenes of being a child actor, but like even beyond that, I think it's an important story. Like, it's important to hear about the abuses in the industry and like things we could maybe do to change that. But I think I highly recommend. It's so fun to be on the hype train. I will say about the audiobook, she talks so fast. Like, I had a lot of trouble with the audiobook. Had I known I was going to get the physical copy for my birthday, I would have just waited for this. But I will definitely be rereading it at some point because her talking speed was like too much for me. But I really enjoyed this, and I would recommend it if you're interested by memoirs like that, because this was a pretty fantastic one. Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez. This is another ebook that I got from my library. This is a young adult historical fiction novel about a young girl whose mother dies, and she winds up, like 10 years after her mother dies, going to live with her stepfather, who's the father of her 2 half-siblings. And this is set in the town of New London, right around the time of the New London school explosion. She's Mexican, her stepfather is white, so there's a lot of discussion on racism, both from her stepfather and just like in general within the town. And also she meets a young black boy who she winds up having somewhat of a romance with, and the story kind of goes from there, again with the backdrop of the New London school explosion. I gave this 4 stars. Lots of 4 stars this month again, which is good. I like having 4-star reads. This book was really wonderfully written. I loved the characters in this. Apart from the stepfather, who never really felt like fully fleshed out, they felt so real, and like all of their pain was so absolutely heart-wrenching and so well done. The writing was stunning. Like, everything she wrote was like so beautiful and yet so absolutely crushing, because this book was tragic, like absolutely like so crushingly tragic, and to pair that with like really beautiful writing was like a wonderful juxtaposition that I would highly recommend. Like, if you like reading a good like historical fiction novel that's just full of pain, 10 out of 10 would recommend this. I like my books full of tragedy, and this was just like anything you could think of. The racism, like I mentioned before, was very big. There was a lot of sexism in this book. There is a lot of sexual assault coming from her stepfather. There's a lot going on, a lot of racism. The racism was definitely the major focus of the story. My main issue with this book came with the ending. So much of the book felt real, and it felt like crushing, and it impacted me really hard emotionally, which I loved. And then we got to the ending, and the ending was tragic, like absolutely like beyond like just tragic. I don't want to like give details obviously, but like not a happy ending. But it felt like at some point in the ending things stopped having so much of an emotional impact. And I don't think it was like the things that actually happened. I don't think it was the fact that it was so full of tragedy. it just felt like it got a lot faster paced and it got harder for me to connect with what was actually happening. And it kind of lost me there because of that. Like, there was so much that I wanted to feel for what was going on because it was so sad, but it wasn't making me feel that emotion. Like, when there's so much brutality on the page, I want to feel that. Like, I want it to make me hurt. And the ending of this kind of didn't. It left me feeling a little bit empty, which was kind of why this wasn't like a favorite amazing book, but I would highly recommend it. I think it was so well done. I think it was fantastic. I would definitely read Perez again. Like, she's a great writer. Like, this book was amazing. Like, highly recommend if you're interested in like historical fiction. I do wish there'd been a little bit more about the New London school explosion, because that was kind of like a very small like secondary plot point for how like major it was. I kind of thought it was going to be the main focal point, and it really wasn't. But even like that aside, like, such a good book. Like, definitely recommend picking it up. And then I finally read a physical book, and off of my TBR, no less. I only read 3 of my TBR books for the month, so not doing TBRs monthly anymore. I read Go for the Goal, A Champion's Guide to Winning in Soccer and Life by Mia Hamm, which I gave 4 stars again. I wasn't expecting much from this book, if I'm being perfectly honest. This is a nonfiction book basically about like soccer. It's very hard to describe. Like, it's just basically Mia Hamm wrote a book that has a lot of soccer tips in it, but also like personal anecdotes. So it's like kind of half, maybe like 1/3 autobiography, 1/3 soccer like information, like factual information, like instructions for drills, like various other things like that, like techniques, and then 1/3 like vague general advice, like, you know, success breeds success and things like that. So I gave it 4 stars. That might have been a little bit generous, and I think that was partially because had I read this book when I was 10, this would have been the most amazing thing I'd ever read. Like, it's definitely geared towards like a younger audience. Like, if you are 10 years old and super into soccer, especially if you don't have like a soccer coach in your life who really knows what they're doing. Like, I didn't have a real soccer coach until I was like 15. This would have been amazing for me. Like, 10 out of 10. This would have been everything in my life at the time. So I do think that kind of like bumped this up a little higher for me. I wasn't expecting it to be so much like specific soccer information. Like, it is a lot of like drills and like diagrams of how to do things, and like, that's amazing. Like, that would have been amazing for me like 20 years ago. Like, 20 years ago, this book, 5 stars. Now I think it's worthwhile. I can see there being like a good audience for this. There are probably better books out there. I really enjoyed the stuff about like, not so much her personal life, but like the behind the scenes of the national team. Like, she talked about specific games, like specific events that happened, like specific plays that she made or her teammates made, which I really enjoyed, because I was a little young for like this version of the US women's national team, but like, still a big Mia Hamm fan. I liked it. I don't know. There's probably no one watching my booktube channel who would read this book or get anything out of it, but I enjoyed it. It surprised me. It was a lot better than I expected it to be, so made me happy anyway. Life's Dominion, An Argument About Abortion, Euthanasia, and Individual Freedom by Ronald Dworkin. This, I mean, that's the description of this book. It's nonfiction. It's a legal argument. I gave this 2 stars. I think I had very mixed feelings about this book. It took me forever to read. I will say, based on the title, I thought this book was going to be a lot more about euthanasia. Like, I thought it was going to be like equal parts euthanasia and abortion, and I was much more interested in the legal argument about euthanasia. This book is like entirely about abortion, with like an extra chapter and a half at the end that's euthanasia focused. So, didn't love that. I also found this really repetitive. Essentially, this book focuses on Dworkin's main argument, which is people who are pro-life don't actually believe that a fetus is a human being in its own right, with like its own desire not to be killed. There's a legal word for that. I can't think of it. Anyway, that they're not actually believing that a fetus is a person. Rather, the belief is closer to the sanctity of human life, and that while a fetus is not a person, human life has inherent value. That's basically what he's arguing, but phrased like much better than I am, because I can't remember what terminology he used. He repeats that a lot. Like, every time he made an argument or a point, he would call back to his original point and like reiterate it over and over again with every point that he made throughout this book. And it was like, my dude, I get it. Like, I understand the argument you're making. You can stop repeating that and say better things. It was like, I would have enjoyed this a lot better had it been shorter. Like, had he cut out a lot of the repetition, had he like cut out some of the pointless, annoying, tangential stuff. Like, he went on a very long ableist rant at one point, which I think was like half intention to be ableist because of like the subject matter, and also like half not. It was just kind of was. And then he had this whole long thing about like, it's sadder if a 10-year-old dies than if a 3-year-old dies, and how this is a commonly held belief. And I was like, that's not one that I've heard before, but okay. And it was just like, there was a lot going on that wasn't really necessary. But like, he did make some really good points, and he had some interesting ideas. I just think had this been condensed to like a 30 or 40 page essay, it would have been a lot better, because it wouldn't have had any of like the extraneous stuff that made this worse. I wouldn't really recommend it. It's also old. This is like early 90s, so I don't know. I wasn't overly impressed by this, but I did think there was a little bit in it that was worth reading. There's better discussions on abortion and euthanasia though. And I was just disappointed how little was about euthanasia, because that was very interesting. He had one chapter at the end that was about euthanasia, and then one chapter about dementia and how that affects like people's autonomy and right to autonomy. So that was like, those two were very interesting. The rest of the book could have been like much more condensed, but I still read it, so that's something at least. Then I read The Lost Man by Jane Harper, another Jane Harper book. My hold came in very quickly on this. This is another adult mystery set in the Australian outback, in very rural Australia. Basically like farming people, not farming, landowners who raise cattle for slaughter. Not that that's really relevant. A man's brother is found dead. He was out in the wilderness for like a day and died of dehydration and heat, because it's a very like dangerous environment to live in. And essentially they're trying to figure out like, this is a very suspicious death, like what happened? Like, obviously he wasn't like stabbed to death or something, like he died from the elements, but he should have known better than to be out here without his car. So what happened is essentially the main question. There's a lot of family secrets, there's a lot of like drama. I gave this 4 stars. I didn't love this as much as The Survivors. The Survivors was like addicting and engrossing and so wonderful and beautifully written. This was fantastic, but like not to that level. It took me a lot longer to get into this. The characters weren't as immediately like interesting. Like, they were very interesting people, but it took so long to learn about them that it made it really harder to like get into the story, because it was like, by the time I got invested in the characters and their lives, we were already at like the halfway point in the book, and it was like, by the time we got there, I loved this, but it took so long to get there that it kind of made it less to me. But again, basically the same positives as with The Survivors. The characters are fantastic. They're the driving force of the story. They're so wonderfully crafted. The setting is beautiful. The setting is such an important part of both The Survivors and this, and they're very different settings. They're both so well done. I don't know about the accuracy of it. Like, I live in the United States, not the Australian outback, but like, it felt so real. It felt so raw. Like, this book felt very raw. The only other things I had issue with, the ending felt like very easily resolved. Didn't love the ending of The Survivors either, so maybe that's a flaw here. But this ending, just like, I liked what happened. It just felt like it was a little bit too easy, a little bit too like neat for how messy the book was, but really wonderful. Would definitely recommend this one as well. Then I read How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith. This was my 1 5-star read of the month. This was so good. Highly recommend, like 10 out of 10. Read this book if you read nothing else. This is a nonfiction book essentially discussing how we deal with slavery in America today. Basically, Clint Smith, the author, goes around to different historical sites in America and kind of investigates and discusses how they're dealing with slavery, like how they talk about slavery, how they've made it part of this historical site, and how they're educating people about slavery as it deals with that historical site. So, for example, he goes to Monticello at one point, which is Thomas Jefferson's home, and he takes the slavery tour at Monticello, and he talks to the tour guide about like how he does the tour and the kind of people he gets and like what he thinks of like the tour and his history and education. And he like interviews people who are on the tour about like their experiences with it and like what they learned and how they felt about it. And he talks to like the director of the program, and then he like goes into Monticello's history to discuss like different aspects of like how they've gotten to the point they are today. And like it's really interesting. And he does this with like a number of different sites. He goes to the Whitney Plantation down in New Orleans. He goes to a Confederate church and actually attends like a Confederate gathering at that church and discusses and interviews people who are like, I forget what the group is called, like Sons of the Confederacy or something like that. And it was like a really interesting book. At one point he goes to Africa, to a slave port there, and it was just like so well done and so interesting. It is very much about like the present day and also like his journey, like what he's doing to like research this stuff. It's very much like you get some of the history of slavery, but like that's not really like the point of the book. The point is more about like what's happening today rather than the past. And it was just so fantastic. It was so well done. Like, I love this. I don't know what else he's written. I think he's done other things and he is a poet, but I would be really interested in more of his nonfiction. If he has more, I hope he does, because this book was like so good. Like, I can't recommend it enough. It is very America-centric, obviously. He's discussing like specifically slavery in America. I just mentioned that because I know a lot of people who watch my channel aren't from America, so it might be like less interesting, less relevant to you, but highly recommend. Like, if you read one thing, if you take one recommendation from me from this video, it's got to be this book. This was stunning. The second book from my September TBR that I got to was A Dangerous Fortune by Ken Follett. This was interesting. This is a historical fiction novel about a man who is like the poor relation of a family. Basically, there's a boarding school and a bad event, a death happens at this boarding school, a very suspicious drowning death. And then years pass and there's the snobby rich part of the family who are also stupid and mean. And then there's this poor guy who's like the cousin of the family, and he's like the smart one and the nice one and the loyal one, but he's also poor. And everyone is against him. And also there's a romance between a girl who is also like a peasant girl who marries rich. And lots of things are happening, and like fortunes are won and lost, and it's a long saga. It's a lengthy book. A lot happens, lots of melodrama. I gave this 3 stars. This was one of those books that I had a good time while reading it. Like, I definitely enjoyed it while I was reading it. And then I was like, every time I put it down, the more I thought about it, the less I liked it. This felt like very like shallow, petty melodrama. You know, it didn't ever really feel real or authentic. It was like a fun drama, but not really something that was like hitting me emotionally. And it was so over the top and so just like cartoonish in the plot. Like, of course, the poor family relation is like the brilliant one who knows everything about the banking industry, and literally everyone else is just cartoonishly mean. Like, they are like the evil villains, like petting the cat on their lap as they're like, "Ah, yes, my precious, we must have our evil plan." And like, it was ridiculous. Like, I'm not saying it was bad. Like, I enjoyed reading it, but it was like so ridiculous and it felt so shallow. Like, it never felt like it was really like doing something authentic, you know? And I like for my books to feel like the emotions to feel real. This didn't feel real. But the thing I really enjoyed about this, like, this book's saving grace. I mean, the story wasn't bad. The story was fine, but it didn't really like do any favors. The characters were all like cardboard cutouts basically. The sex scenes were so awkward. Like, they didn't like offend me, but they were just so badly written. But the thing that I really did enjoy about this book was his writing style, and like the pace of the story was so fantastically done. Like, it was really slow, but in like such a descriptive, detailed way. Like, everything he did and said had purpose and was like used to craft this story. And like, I didn't love the story, but I loved the way he wrote it. So like, I'm very interested to read more from him, and like, hopefully I like those stories a little bit better. Like, this was fine, but it was one of those things where I was like, I will never again think of this book in my life. Like, nothing about this left any sort of impact on me, which is unfortunate because I do like that. But I loved his writing style. I think it was really fantastic, and I'm hoping that like the way people talk about Pillars of the Earth, I'm hoping I love that more, that's like a better story. But I still think this was worth the read. I'm just hoping he has better, because like, for all the hype surrounding Ken Follett, they can't all be like this. Like, there has to be some that are better, because I understand the love for his writing style, but like, the story wasn't really quite there for me. I just realized all the rest of my books are physical books that I read. No more ebooks or audiobooks. Hooray. True Biz by Sara Novic. I read Girl at War earlier this year and loved it, and I was so excited to find out that Sara Novic was coming out with her second book, or her second novel this year. Third book overall, but only 2 were fiction. This is adult fiction about a school for the deaf. It basically focuses on the headmistress of the school and 2 students, and kind of the school is threatened with closure. One of the students is dealing with parents who don't understand her deafness. Like, she was given a cochlear implant at a young age that never really like took the way it was supposed to, and her parents didn't allow her to learn sign language, so she kind of grew up without language to some degree. And then the other student is from a deaf family who's always grown up like surrounded by deafness, and that's just like part of his culture at this point. And this book is like really focused on like deaf culture and what it means, and like the history of deaf culture like tied into the story of like these 3 people, and it's so well done. I gave this 4 stars. I really loved this book. I loved all the characters. Like, everything was tied together so well. Like, I love when characters are well done, especially the female student Charlie. She and her story overall was really fantastic. Like, it was so heartbreaking, like her dealing with her parents who just don't understand, and like they're not trying to hurt her, but they are, and like it was really well done. Like, it was so like, the pain in this, some of the pain is just so raw and like hits you so hard, and it was just fantastic. And this book is own voices, so like you do get that voice of like the knowledge of deaf culture that doesn't come from an outsider, that's just so like detailed, woven into the story. It's so well done. So like, this was just fantastic. I love Sara Novic. The ending was kind of abrupt. I didn't love the ending, but beyond that, I thought this book was really fantastic, and I'm so excited for her to keep writing. Like, I'm now disappointed that it's probably going to be years before we get another novel from her, but highly recommend picking up this book. There was a lot of really great information on deaf culture, and like, she actually has like nonfiction sections in here about ASL that are like tied into the story and like where we are in the narrative. That was great. Like, it's so good. This was such a good book. Like, highly recommend. The final book from my September TBR that I read, third and final, Bee Season by Myla Goldberg. This is an adult fiction novel about a young girl who's kind of like the underachiever in the family. Her mother is a lawyer, her father is a Jewish academic, her brother is brilliant and gifted and does great in school and with Hebrew, and then she's kind of just like mediocre. Like, at this point, people have stopped expecting things from her. And then she wins her school spelling bee, and then the district spelling bee, and then she goes to the national spelling bee, and suddenly she's getting attention from her parents and from other people, and suddenly people expect things from her, and there's jealousy from her brother. And this book was so good. I gave this 4 stars. This was like such a gorgeous portrait of a dysfunctional family, because like this book is about basically what happens when children have to earn the love of a parent, you know? Because both of their parents just kind of like accept things. They're not great parents. They're just like, they show their kids attention when their kids have done something to earn that. And Eliza has never earned the love of her parents, you know? She's never done anything special, and then all of a sudden she has. And that creates conflict with her brother, who is suddenly, for the first time in his life, losing their attention. And you get like how bad she feels. Like whenever she does something negative now, she feels like she's losing that attention, that she's letting them down. And you also get the guilt from her parents, who are realizing like, I should be better than this. Like I should have been showing her attention before. But it's also like they're still blinded by their own like ignorance of the situation and their poor parenting. And like, it is so fantastically done. Like just the family aspect and the family relationships were like everything in this book. It did lose me a bit when we got into the Jewish mysticism bit, and also her brother joins a religious cult. The Jewish mysticism was a lot, and I didn't really understand it, and I really couldn't follow it. It was just well over my head, which was unfortunate, because I do think that impacted my enjoyment of the book. Like, not that it was an element, but just that, like, I really struggled to follow that and, like, the purpose of it within the story. It was so confusing. I could never tell if it was supposed to be, like, a literal thing, or if it was just, like, something her father believed. Like, I don't know. It was over my head. But even like with that element and with kind of the weirdness that the book got into towards the end, it was so good, and I would highly recommend it. Like, just for the family story, it was really, really fantastic. I finally got Karin Slaughter's new book, Girl Forgotten. Finally, this came out in like August, I think, and I've been waiting for it at the library forever. And I finally got my copy. I gave this 4 stars. Did I? No, I gave this 3 stars. But I did really enjoy it, so like 3 stars, 4 stars, whatever. It's my review that matters, not so much the rating. This is a sequel to Pieces of Her. Essentially, in Pieces of Her, a young girl finds out, not a young girl, an adult woman finds out secrets about her mother. And some like witness protection stuff is going on, and like deep dark family history and yada yada. Things happen, most of them bad. This is a thriller. The follow-up to that, the main character from that book, it's several years later. She has now become a U.S. Marshal, and she's getting her first assignment, which is to protect this judge, but also she's looking into the murder that happened like 30 years before of the judge's daughter. So this is told in dual timeline, from Andrea, the main character, and then in the present, and then in the past, the girl who was murdered like 30 or 40 years ago. Like I said, 3 stars. I like Karin Slaughter's writing style. I like the grisliness of her books. They're very brutal, and they feel like they just hit you kind of hard. And like, they're just good. They flow really well. I'm really invested. Even when there are flaws, I'm still like down. Like, I'm always down for her books. So this one was not my favorite. It kind of fell into the trap that happens a lot with books that flip between the past and the present, where I didn't really care about one of those, so I was like disappointed every time it did. The past bits, some of them were okay, but so much about the past was the teenage girl trying to figure out who had sexually assaulted her and gotten her pregnant. And it was like her own like mini investigation kind of, and it was just boring at a point, because it was the same thing over and over. She was just investigating and never finding anything out, and it was just like you were getting the same information. Nothing new ever happened. So I just got bored during the history segments. And then you got to the present, where Andrea was conducting her own investigation, and that was a lot more interesting to me, because you were getting new things. Like, you were understanding more of what was going on, and like, I wish there had been more than that. And I think because of that, when we got to the end, there was too much going on, so like nothing really got wrapped up well. Like, of the like 3 main things that needed to be wrapped up in the ending, 2 of them didn't get very much. Like, one of them happened completely off screen. One of them was so fast it barely happened in the book. And then only one of them got like kind of a decent resolution, and it just needed a lot more time and a lot more actual like presence in the story. And I just think it could have done with like less of the what happened in the past and a lot more of Andrea's specific investigation. And then the only other thing that I kind of disliked from this was just that it did the thing where like a thriller sequel has to make it like personal again. So then it just feels like it's stretching way too far to make it personal to the main character. And it was so unnecessary. Like, she's already a US Marshal. Why does this have to relate to her own past? Why can't this just be a case that she's investigating? Like, because it just feels kind of ridiculous at a point when you're reading it. You're like, why? Like, why does this need to be happening? Why do we need to like be revisiting her past when it has so little to do with like this actual story? I don't know, but I think Karin Slaughter's a really good writer. I think she's very compelling with her writing, and I think it's very easy to get invested even when there are like flaws in the story itself. So I enjoyed this. If she writes another sequel to this book, I will read that and probably enjoy it too. So I would recommend, but I think Karin Slaughter has better. So take that with what you will. And the last book that I finished in September was actually one that I started in August and took me forever to read, and that was The Mage-Lord's Legacy by MacLeod. This is the second book in the Constellation saga. I read the first one in August, immediately started this, and then just kind of put it down at one point and had trouble picking it back up. I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. This is a high fantasy series where essentially the Tenebri are a race, a magical race from a different world, and essentially they destroy anywhere they live. They like, when they put their magic into something, they're like sucking its life force and its energy, so they like have to keep moving and destroying more worlds because they eventually get down to nothing. And protecting the world are a group of basically second generation heroes. Their parents were gifted with powers and now the powers have passed on to them, and it's time for them to like have the second round of saving the world basically after their parents did a generation ago. I really enjoyed this. I love the characters. I love the relationships. Like I said, I gave this 4 stars. I think the strength of this book is the characters. Like, everyone is so well done, like so well crafted. Everyone has their own like strengths and weaknesses and flaws and petty arguments, and like it's so good because you get like such a fantastic group dynamic within this book because there's so much conflict, but like it feels like real conflict. It doesn't feel like petty manufactured conflict. It feels like actual like personalities are clashing, and that's why you're getting kind of the arguments that are happening, and it's so well done. And I'm also like super here for like the magical fight that's like coming, and like they all have super cool powers. I think the only the reason I put it down was because there was like a rough bit of animal abuse that like all the like tragic things I can read, animal abuse is the one thing that I just like can't. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me, but like I didn't put it down because the book was bad or anything. It just took me a minute to get past that mentally. But the main issue I had with this one was basically it's gotten to a point where they're just like too many characters, kind of. Like, all the characters are really good and I enjoy them all. Like, they all have very distinct personalities and everything, but it's like there are so many that it's hard to keep up with all of them in a book, even ones that are like main characters. It's like super easy to forget about people, and they keep having to like split up just because there are literally too many to keep up with at this point. And it's just like, I like them all, but also like the cast could be kind of pared down. But I'm really enjoying this. I'm super excited to go on to the 3rd book, and I would highly recommend if you're looking for like a good fantasy series to read. So that was everything that I read in September. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.